fiction, science fiction. We make no guarantees, however, how long it will remain fiction, fiction, fiction.
Collective salutation, Cocknodogs. Welcome to Exofathom. I'm Mike, and today we are going to do some fringe thinking, which hopefully should break up the mundaneness of this Monday. Joined with me are my two lovely co-hosts, Nick and Ayla. Nick, how you doing?
Well, you can't have mundane without Monday, so doing all right.
I shouldn't have laughed at that.
I know.
But it was good. Oh, awesome. Ayla, how about you?
I'm okay. Today's theme seems to have been put up boundaries so people know exactly how to annoy you.
Oh, well, that's interesting. You might.
No, nobody listens to me. I'm always like, please don't do this. And they're like, do that? Okay. So I'm okay, though.
I'm sorry, Mike, were you saying something?
No, I mean, I was just going to agree. That sounded like the story of my life.
It was a joke.
As I just sit here and go like, okay, guys, let's just have a rehash therapy session for me. I'm just going through it. Yeah, no, it's okay, though. It's just a lot of stuff all at once on top of more stuff for 365 days. But, tomorrow the sun rises, and I just discovered that Coffee Bean has amazing tea. Go figure. That's like one of their things. Not Coffee Bean. I'm sorry. Pete's Coffee. So, I think halfway through this show, my chamomile tea will kick in. It should be good.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. I spent half the day on the floor listening to Young, so I reached some pretty depressive thoughts. It's just,
dude,
you come across a thinker and you're just hit in the head with a sledgehammer.
I could co-sign that. Well, you know what I did is I watched Pursuit of Happiness on Saturday night at 2 a.m. or Sunday at 11 p.m. I don't know. It was really late, and I just remember bawling my eyes out because it's such a sad commentary on our world and all sorts of things.
Well, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness doesn't mean you're going to get it.
Right. They just guarantee that you can pursue it.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, put it off. We're good.
Okay, cool. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the collective unconscious. And are either of you familiar with the term, or at least what comes to mind when I say the quote unquote collective unconscious?
Well, I mean, I'm familiar with the term, but not necessarily in the sort of Jungian perspective. I mean, maybe not as thoroughly thought out as Jung, obviously, because he spent his entire life thinking about this. But I definitely am aware of it. I definitely can kind of feel inklings of it in my life once in a while if I pay attention. So yeah, it's a subject that really fascinates me. I'm very much about this conversation.
Cool.
Nice.
Ayla?
Yeah, not formally. I don't think I've read much about what Jung thought about it, or maybe I did and I just can't recall at the moment. But I love this image work that Nick did with the glacier because, yeah, I think that, we still don't really know what our consciousness is, or our unconscious or subconscious. And then, on the grander scale, I think that we're a lot like bees, a lot of bees and herd animals, they can read cues. Like for example, deer, let's say they're in a meadow and there's a body of water to the right and a body of water to the left. Well, they'll start grazing, and then pretty soon when one of them is thirsty, it looks up and it looks at the water it wants to drink from. And then another one looks up and it looks at the water it wants to drink from. Pretty soon there's a weird like thing where enough of them are looking at one body of water where they're just all, okay, we're going to go this way now. And so I think that, humans like to forget that we're a part of the natural world. And I think that so much of our like individual thinking has really clouded maybe our understanding of the collective unconsciousness and the beauty of how intertwined we are. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's like totally fringe, but I'm excited to talk about this too.
No. I'm just thinking about what you were saying. That's all, and it gets close because it's like for me, I've kind of like touched on this a little bit in university just through studying, like getting into philosophy and things like that, and finding my way through YouTube lectures and whatnot. And then as I hit like my late 20s, I had a series of psychological events that forced me to kind of dive into what Jung would call the shadow, like confront it properly and keep pushing further into my personal subconscious, which led to a nice little bridge into what he would define as like the collective unconscious. So maybe we should start first with like how would you think of your own unconscious mind, I guess? Like, do you think there's any difference between that and the collective unconscious, or are the two the same idea to you?
I think of it as kind of, for lack of a better metaphor or simile, I think it's kind of like an operating system in which it's like latently connected to the internet. And, like this operating system runs in the background. It's connected to every other operating system in the world. But, like if you're not necessarily a computer programmer or somebody well-versed in code, you don't really understand how the things are connected and perhaps even the information that's being transferred between the two. But, like that's where the sort of foremind starts processing the unconscious mind. But I don't know if there's any distinction between the collective unconscious and then your personal unconscious too, because there's just so many similarities between the things that we create as archetypes and the things that we as humans admire and look up to and dislike, and all of these things seem to be connected by a certain thread. So perhaps there's a little bit of flavoring you can do on your own personal subconscious, but I definitely think that there's very little distinction between the two.
There is definitely like a client, like in computer science, be like a client server type model where your own personal computer is connected up to this internet. You could call this internet. There is a distinction. So like the collective unconscious would be all of humanity's unconscious put together for all of time. So going way back to ancient time, even now. But your personal subconscious is like your own little server, I guess, that you communicate with. And then that server connects to the wider internet of sorts that's connected through all of time with these abstract symbols, I guess. But the thing that other people interact with wouldn't be too much like computer code. It would be more like a browser, like a Firefox or a Google Chrome or a Brave browser. And that's kind of becomes your persona, your mask in a way.
Yeah, on the front facing interface sort of thing.
Yeah, and there could be a lot of processing that happens in between you and your personal subconscious or your personal unconscious, but what you show to others is not necessarily who you really are, and that seems to have a separate connection to the wider internet of archetypes. And we'll get into that word because that word brings in a lot of issues even for Jung, where he can disagree with how it's being used now, like it's lost its meaning, so to say. But Ayla, do you consider your unconscious separate from the collective unconscious, or do you think they are the same thing just from your like day-to-day life?
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, I feel like they're the same. I kind of subscribe to the, we're not special mentality, and we're just kind of all the same, and thinking we're separate, but we're all kind of special in that we're all the same. Because, fundamentally, humans kind of want the same things for the most part, and I think there's complexities and such, but yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
what do humans want? Tell me what humans want. What do they really want?
Well, we want to like not be murdered. We like food. Love is nice. Touch is nice. So, and then it's like you start wondering though, because then it's like, well, if it's just a matter of like we all want to be like at peace or content or happy or whatnot, then like where does dopamine come into play? Or yeah, I don't know. I mean, because you get to those fundamental things, and it's kind of like you can be happy having nothing too. Like, there's people that find ways through difficulty, and they realize that they don't need anything to be happy. It's totally separate. And so I think probably the way I would think about it would be that there's layers. So in one lens, we're all the same, and then in another lens we're all vastly different, and it just depends on how your aperture is getting wider or narrower, to kind of bring in the realities of space and time and fifth dimensional realities and things like that.
Yeah. You brought up not being murdered, which seems like an important thing. So we can start to like talk about archetypes, these things that exist as nebulous thoughts, like they exist in the collective unconscious, and the way we pull an idea of a predator might be different for everybody. And I'll tell, like, I guess an anecdote and then get your thoughts and like what you think a predator is. Because it's something obviously like ancient that we've had to deal with before we've even arguably developed some sort of reflective consciousness, which ends up being a big part of this notion of the collective unconscious. Because if you're merely acting and doing and not reflecting, you're kind of unconscious of your actions. So this was a few years ago, and I had a giant beard. It was like pretty much down to I don't know, down to my mid chest area. And I had a hoodie on, and I was going to a pizza shop. And I was already tired, so I probably looked like I had resting predator face or something. And I arrived to the pizza shop. I get out of the car, and next to me is another car. The door swings open, and this woman goes to get out, looks at me, and screams at the top of her lungs, slams the door closed. Right? And I'm
fucking rude.
Right? And I'm standing there processing this. I'm like, what? Just because my mind was off in programming land. And I'm just trying to make sense of what's going on. And she opens up the door and looks at me and says, sorry. And then slowly closes the door. And
Oh, no. Sorry, I don't know if this is going somewhere really sad, but at the moment, it's just reminding me of like another anecdote. But I love it. Continue.
Well, I got my pizza, so I was happy. And that doesn't. Yeah,
was it a hot and ready?
No, it was not Little Caesars. It was a slightly higher end mom and pop's pizza shop.
Ooh, but, Papa John's. Okay.
No.
No.
Not a chain. And Papa John's sucks. Like the sweet sauce, never mind. But to process what, like, to try to throw a bit of empathy, what was going on in her mind, I feel like, is that somewhere along the way, she had this notion of what a predator human looks like, right? And how they would look. And she tapped in a split second to her unconscious mind, which tapped into this collective unconscious and retrieved this image of a predator, pulled it down, and then with the emotional charge, it gave it this psychic value of her committing to action, screaming and slamming the door shut, right? Because it's a very emotional response that she did as self-preservation as well. So what like that is like one person's idea of a predator archetype. I can make the argument. Nick, would you agree, disagree? And like, what is your idea of like a predator archetype?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with your assessments, certainly. And I was trying to think about this while you were kind of elaborating. I honestly, I would have to say, I guess the predator archetype would be something that is registered as existential threat. And I don't necessarily know. I mean, like, there is no one name for that, I don't think, and it's all very subjective. And I think that the key to this sort of conversation, at least one part of it, is that the threat assessment levels in humans are incredibly suggestive and subjective. Pardon me, and they usually have to do with past history and experience. Because the assessment of a predator isn't necessarily something. And then, like, look, there are biological metrics in which a predator, or threat assessment does take place, but especially in humans, now that we're kind of engineered ourselves outside of the food chain. More so, I believe that threat assessment, it has to do with upbringing, perhaps familial conditioning, and things like that. So, maybe this person had a terrible run-in with a person with a beard, and ever since she just can't see a beard without screaming.
It's hilarious.
Which is yeah. I mean, maybe she was maybe she fought pirates in a past life or something. I don't know, but I definitely think that there's it's a very subjective sort of thing, and it's subjective, funnily enough, because we've created such a luxurious lifestyle as humans. Threat assessment has become something that we can kind of be selective about now, which is interesting, I think. And so I think there's something definitely there, because an animal doesn't have the luxury of selecting threat assessment. A deer doesn't know that you're not a bear. If it sees you, it's running away.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something interesting about the fact that we as humans can kind of evaluate and sort of prioritize levels of threat.
Yeah, it's that reflective, conscious type thing. And two, like when I have long hair and a beard and it's dark, I can look like an animal. And so there might be something that taps into that primal fear of like, that's a lion. That's a big freaking lion.
Right.
But she gave it time and saw that like nothing bad was going to happen and actually apologized. So it's that it was like a weird attack into her own unconscious that was informed by a collective unconscious, which then through reflection she was able to fix. And maybe too, like it might be an environmental thing, right? Like like a class issue type thing, where maybe because around my area it can look a little rough, especially at night. Lots of tagging, lots of graffiti, lots of trash thrown, litter. It's can be a transient area. We have a few different major bus lines that run through the area that connects both poor and rich areas. So maybe she just came from a wealthier area where those things weren't there, and so her nerves were also heightened, right? Because again, this collective unconscious thing, it starts to play into the guard where she's looking around. It's like, this isn't my usual environment, and this is one that is a bit more dilapidated, and through news or through information gathering, I've understood that this usually means there's more crime around here.
So do you think that we can socially engineer collective unconsciousness? Because I mean, like, if you just taking off your example, like the concept of being in a different class situation, perhaps that to me sounds like it's much more socially engineered than biological. Now, obviously, there's threats everywhere, and especially somebody who's a female. And I assume that this wasn't during the daytime.
Yeah, no, it was nighttime.
Right, and so
I'm a night owl, so I'm only out at night.
Right. So, like you compound all of these things together, and then it becomes this really complicated milieu of upbringing plus social conditioning plus, collective unconscious. And it's like, no wonder we can't really make heads or tails of our knee-jerk impulses. They're just so layered, and there's so many stimuli that contribute to them.
Yeah, I would agree that it is more socially engineered when you get out of your social class, because you don't have the personal experience to rely on. And this
Right.
is psychology and therefore philosophy. And the only really real way to learn this stuff is through personal experience. So
Mhm.
the more you rely on this collective unconscious nature, like all rich people act like this, all poor people act like that, instead of spending time and talking to individuals, which would feed that personal experience thing. Because
Mm.
rich and poor can be archetypes that we build through collective unconscious, or through
Mhm.
exploring that, through, I guess, tapping on it and trying to pull down information. So yeah, I do think that it can be socially engineered and hacked, especially if you
Mm.
take it by culture basis, which is just a smaller collective unconscious rather than
Right.
a wide, human collective unconscious.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes me think about, there's the levels of nuance, like kind of like Ayla said, the layers to all of this that could be at play. I mean, a collective unconscious now seems to me to be this sort of umbrella term for so many other things as well. It's really fascinating because you can see where that knee jerk reaction comes from, and it comes from fear, and it comes from, like you said, self preservation.
Yeah, it makes
Um,
sense why one would do that, right?
yeah.
But it's like, as Young talks about, it's this doing thing that humans do without thinking, and it's
Hmm.
and it's something that's born from before the times where we didn't have the luxury of just chilling and reflecting, which is really what you need to do in order to kind of think your way out of always unconsciously behaving.
Hmm.
Like maybe,
Getting out of the animal mind.
yeah, which
Hmm.
is like, seems like pretty hardwired linked into this collective unconscious. And like, the smaller the collective is, the easier it is to kind of hack the group, right? Because
Hmm.
now it might be connected to something wider, but the personal experiences they're having with this outsider weighs heavier than normal experiences.
Mm.
Ayla, what do you think about this whole predator story? Well,
Well, yeah, no, it's just kind of funny because it's like a side thing. It reminds me of I was in Boston once. The last time I'll ever go to Boston. And I mean, let's see. I would just say I got a
sorry, red
really
flags talk.
negative vibe in Boston, and I don't like being around negative areas. But it probably also has something to do with the fact that my friend, we were lost and we stopped at a gas station for directions, and the guy wanted to charge me to give me help. And I've never encountered that. Like, LA is a surprisingly friendly place. You ask somebody for directions and they'll be happy to help you. Um, so I didn't have my wallet. So I go stomping to my friend's car and I bust in and I'm all upset and I'm ranting about this guy. And I look to my left and the woman in the car is not my friend. I literally just got inside some stranger's car and started yelling about something like in an angry, upset way. And then she screamed, and then I screamed, and she yelled, "Get out of my car." And of course, I run out of the car and she drives off, and I'm like mortified. I'm also really confused because I don't know where my friend went. Turns out she wasn't allowed to park wherever she parked, and so she went around to the back of the gas station. By the time I reconvene with my friend, I tell her what's happening. She had popped outside of the car. And then she starts laughing at me, and I'm like really upset because I just traumatized some poor person who happened to be across the parking lot, and she saw what happened, and there was just a nice wave, and I mean, it was very like easy to laugh it off. But you can see how if any of the demographics had changed, if any of the power dynamics had changed, if any of the content of language like there's just a lot of opportunity for
Things to
threat
go sideways.
things to go sideways, exactly. And so like even with the lady, I mean, like, you don't know if like actually her, I think this is like brain injury awareness month, so she could have had a concussion that just like wired her brain weird. She could have Tourette's. You're right, she could have had a response to the beard. Maybe it wasn't the beard. Maybe you had a cologne on. Like, I'll never forget the cologne of my first boyfriend. If I get that whiff, I'm like, oh, where is he? I gotta go.
I don't wear cologne.
Oh, okay.
It's cigars over cologne for me.
Did you say cigars?
Yeah, cigars over cologne. For real. No, it's interesting. Yeah, and like it shows sort of your archetypes too. Like to laugh it off, this implies the jester archetype, someone that can laugh at themselves, but may say the wrong thing or
has that, like, you know, terribly depressed other side to them. Yes. No. As I laugh it off.
You just simply want to enjoy life no matter what. So
I mean,
it could also be like the innocent archetype where like you weren't expecting that environmental change so you just got in that car and expected that your friend was in there, so you're like, oh yeah, the world's not going to change. It always is. But
look, if somebody parks their car, it's not outside of the realm of possibility to assume that they will still be there when you come back, unless your friend's a jerk and they're like, oh, I'm going to go move the car, which she didn't have a choice. Let's be clear. But
I really hope that this car had completely blacked out windows.
I hope it was the same type of car too, not
it
like
was. It was like
one's a Jeep and like one's a smart car or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, no, it was like super dark at night. It was like a poorly lit area, and I think like I think it was like a rental car, but it was like a dark green sedan, like a forest green, and then the lady's car was like a dark charcoal or like a matte black or something. They look very similar.
Were they the same car or no?
Very similar.
No, they weren't. They weren't the same car.
I just like and you know, I think back on that too. Like I was so flustered by the attendant like denying me directions, because obviously like that's something that I would never charge somebody for directions. So I just was flabbergasted and like I don't know. Silly.
Well, you might charge somebody if there's you're the 1,000th person that's come in there and not bought anything and asked for directions.
True, but then I would also have to ask myself, what am I doing wrong with my merchandising that people don't want to buy my stuff? Like this guy had like
don't merchant blame.
He had like 5-year-old. No, there's
merchant blaming.
Have you ever heard of Chico sticks? It's like a coconut. Okay, if there's
terrible.
I love Chico sticks, but the problem is anywhere that sells Chico sticks, they're always like 5 years expired. I swear
because
to God.
they don't make them anymore. They won't make them. They're just selling their remaining stock.
It's so good. We're getting off the rails here. I think that it's interesting though, Mike, that this person apologized to you. Like, do you recall what happened between the moment of terror and the moment of composure?
I stood there with a really dumb look on my face, trying to figure out what was going on. Because I'm not like, I don't consider myself a threat. I've been around other people that have, and I've had to like do active work to move them away from that because it's just not true. But the moments where she like opened up her door, it was just like, what's happening here? What's going on? It could also be my inability to understand social cues and things like that. But for the best, it's probably just me just trying to process what was going on in my environment. But the understanding of the archetype of the predator is important though, right? It can save lives. Like if I did have malicious intent, then it would have protected her in theory, right? We won't get into whether or not car windows can be broken with weapons or anything like that, but like it's there for a reason, just so like that hardwired to the collective unconscious is still important, but it can build in these prejudices, these biases. The
flip side of the predator coin is the protector, right? So you still need that same energy. Sheepdog have to be as vicious as wolves in order to fight them off. So it's like So yeah, there's a which is really interesting about all these archetypes, like you mentioned about explaining Ayla's. It's like there's usually two sides to each of them, or at least there are pros and cons to both to each of them.
And we're trying to understand, like the about like the caregiver archetype. Yeah, the protector. They're all the same. But we're doing this in instant, like because we have it's all built around surviving. It's all built around the unconscious mind, at least, right? So it happens instantly, and I find that part so fascinating. But you stay too connected to this collective unconscious, then you have a tendency to, like, if you're not aware of it, you drift into becoming an NPC, which I think is a more modern archetype, right? And because our modern civilization is so complicated, so there's so many layers to it, so many things happening at once, it sometimes can be a detriment to rely too heavily on the collective unconscious or the collective conscience as a whole, rather than sitting in a room thinking and trying to work things out for yourself.
Yeah. And then, having too much reliance on that, sort of reflective self makes you a navel gazer. And, you tend to become an isolatory individual because you set yourself onto a mountain. You know what I mean? Like, so I definitely get that. Like there's a balance that must be struck for sure. And, to talk about the collective unconscious too, like I think there's definitely positives to it as well, because when I think of collective unconscious, I think of this sort of like quasi-psychic sort of impulse that it seems all sentient beings on Earth have. So Ayla, you mentioned the sort of like psychic communication between deers about choosing a watering hole. Now, like most of that is run off of this sort of subconscious instinct of, okay, well, if there are more of us at one watering place, then we can watch each other, and then, predators won't be able to get us as easily. Now that's not being cognitively thought of, but that's sort of like an instinctual impulse. So what I think is interesting is that even sometimes when our instincts are invalid, they're still useful because they could eventually be valid. And so in the instance in which the lady sort of jeered at your presence, that was an invalid response, but that response could eventually be something that saves her from danger. Yeah.
No, it's not invalid. It was just an example of how it could be used at the wrong time, right? Like why do we not why do most people find apprehension in going to social places alone? Very much of that deer-like subconscious quality, right? Like, how many people go to the movie theaters and get a ticket for one?
Not very many. Pre-COVID,
yeah. Or go to the bar alone, right? Or do things like that alone. But yeah, no, like my archetype, the negatives that I deal with is I tend to be a heavy in exploration, like the explorer archetype. I like to travel and like just wander, both in thought and in physical actions. The downside, though, is that I may get lost in thought. I can spend days just thinking about one thing and following it to its logical extreme. So that's where the isolatory things can be bad, but I'm still in like always connected to that unconscious, but I see it, become aware of it, and rather enjoy it. Like that's like hopefully the goal that I want from this conversation is like all of us to start to see our archetypes, so to say, because what we end up doing is weaving all these different ones together, because none of us are just a single one, right? We're a collective group of sub-personalities that usually get compartmentalized due to society. It tells us we have to have this outward face. This outward face does this. That stays separate from this thing that you do by yourself, which is different from this thing that you do with your friends, blah, blah, blah. You're showing different sub-personalities in that. But to integrate all these together would be the process of individuation, where we can kind of pull from the collective unconscious with full awareness that we're doing it, or at least somewhat of some bits of awareness. This is what I've grasped from kind of tapping into that collective unconscious. But I do think there is a message sending mechanism to it, just like multiple servers can talk to each other. Yeah, multiple humans can talk to each other, send images to each other, I think, through dreams, right? Through shared symbolisms.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I definitely think that there's something there too. And I don't necessarily know if it's, like, I don't know how I would grasp it, but the best I can describe it as that sort of telepathic signaling that animals do. And it's definitely one of those things where I feel it the most when you know, like, I'm sure everybody feels this at one point or another in their lives. You can feel eyes from across the room. I've had many times where I've felt somebody's presence from across the room.
Yeah, I've had an office job. I get it.
Yeah. Well, not even just that, like even at a bar or a restaurant or something like that. Like like you can pick up on somebody who just doesn't have that who has a vibe that you're like, hey, I don't know about that person. I mean, keep an eye on that person.
Are we going to start talking about the male gaze?
The male gaze? No. But I mean, but as a male, that gaze, like we spent most of our adolescent lives trying to avoid the stare, right? Because the stare is you make eye contact with me and we're about to fight.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so that's that type of thing that I think is like ingrained, at least in men and probably in women too, to a certain level, where it's like you can feel the eyes on you because you've been primed to recognize that a stare is a confrontation.
Yeah. And definitely you can, picking up vibes in their room, right? Like understanding who may be a potential threat and who may not. Again, I guess threat assessment, right? But no, yeah, I can consider it. But that's like a much more controlled collective unconscious, right? It seems like it's almost like a mesh network of human beings where like the physical area is closing off these individuals. They're all kind of, vibe checking each other, I guess. And you can actually direct energy in a certain way. I guess in work environments, you want everybody to be more productive, right? So that feeling of having a manager staring at you or something like that, you're like, I guess I got to get off of Facebook or whatever and start doing something, start being productive. Or
I better start doing something.
Oh,
I love it.
I'm answering an email, I swear.
Oh man, I remember. Yeah, no, it's funny. Like things that we assume. Like I always, had jobs where if you finish the job, you can go home, right? Like you have your own department, or like I was like a supervisor at a coffee shop once. Like there's just certain jobs you're done and you go home. And then I worked at a scuba shop that was inside of a larger store that had apparel sections and like different other sections. And I just remember like I prepped my entire area like the whole day. So once we closed, I needed like 15 minutes and then I was ready. I clocked out and I'm walking out the door because my assumption is that my division's taken care of. And the manager was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "What do you mean, what am I doing?" It's like, "No, you have to go help apparel. We can't leave until everybody's done." And I'm like, "What?" What? Because the people that were working the apparel section were just chit-chatting all day, and they just let the clothes in the dressing room pile and pile. And like, I hate putting things on hangers. That's why I was in scuba, not apparel. So I just, I thought that was a really funny thing because your assumptions can really, I don't know what their collective unconscious was about, like,
maybe you weren't
sitting around chatting all day.
Maybe you weren't hooked into their network. You didn't even pick up on the fact they're just chit-chatting. Should have walked over and be like, "Hey, can you hang some of these clothes?"
Or maybe they knew that at the end of the day, everybody was going to help them with their stuff.
All I know is after that day, I never pre-prepped scuba. I was back there washing wetsuits and doing visual inspections of cylinders until close. So it's like, it's funny because we adapt as well. And I think like that's the other thing, is there's like this collective unconscious, which we feel like we're kind of burdened to, that it controls us. And then there's this idea that, like, no, we can overcome that. We can overcome biases. We can overcome our experiences, our lived experiences about things. But then, I think there's still that debate over like how far you can come along. And especially if things keep changing, it's like, how do you kind of navigate your world? But then I think maybe that's what you were saying, Nick, when you kind of get like too heady about it and then you become reclusive, like, I'm just not going to do anything. I'm gonna sit in my scuba department and like hide back here. So I don't know.
Well,
It's interesting.
To break that down, like, so the chit chatters, they're enjoying life, right? Can again go back to the jester archetype, where jesters can be lazy at times, along with also as lewd. But
Did you say lewd?
yeah,
Okay, I haven't heard that word. That's such a, like, I don't know,
an old
old-timey
person's word.
Huh?
Yeah, it's almost like I got this from Young or some shit. But maybe lewd, blah blah blah. Unconscious archetypes. Yeah, okay. The process of individuation. So the way that you overcome this is through individuation, is understanding who you are by confronting your own personal unconscious through this shadow, and you end up meeting this contrasexual entity called the anima or animus, which acts as the bridge between your unconscious and the collective unconscious. Because in reality, there was nothing stopping you from going home at the end of your day, right? You could have been like, well, it's not my fault these people didn't do their job. I'm heading out.
I should
And
have.
You could have left, right? Yeah. You were still kind of connected to that collective a little bit too much, where you're like, what? Why do I have to stay here? I have to help who? So that's where that bit of isolation, true isolation, not going back to your scuba department, but sitting alone and processing your thoughts and like, am I okay with risking a job for saying, I'm not going to go help somebody else who didn't do their job when they were supposed to, right? And then you have to start to pull in something like the rebel archetype, where it's like you don't care what other people think about you because of X, Y, and Z.
Sorry, I just like the rebel archetype. It sounds so groovy.
But they too can be a bit lewd and a bit greedy, a bit hostile. So there's like that fine balance of picking the proper mask to wear as the persona, picking the proper mask at the proper time to get the goal, the best outcome for you and hopefully the group, right? And the best may not always be like we all help each other out, but maybe somebody learns a bit more about responsibility of, hanging up the clothes from the dressing room.
Well, they never will if everybody else does their job for them. Now, will they? I'm thinking about like the grasshopper and the ant. That's like an Aesop's fable, which, because as you were talking about that, it was making me think about where Jung got these archetypes. Like, do you know, and sorry to put you on the spot if you don't, but like out of curiosity, do you know how he, like his methodology for pulling in the different archetypes?
Studying his whole life, he studied natural symbols and mythologies. So mythologies from all around the world, and comparing those symbols. And
that's so cool.
Yeah, deriving from them commonalities. So like in a computer science version, we would call it abstraction. Like just bringing these symbols together or bringing these ideas together and say, oh, you really mean this idea. In machine learning sense, it's just thinking of things in a higher dimension. But yeah, that was his main method. And he was also a psychologist, so he also talked to a lot of people too.
Yeah.
I have a question. Do you think, since we're on the subject of folding clothes, do you think
Which is the worst? I have a pile I've been sitting on.
All right, well, don't dive any deeper in that. Do you think do you think that there needs to be maintenance on the subconscious or the collective unconscious? My question being is that if there's people at this establishment who have to do all the folding of clothes at the end of the day, do you think that there's a similar task of maintenance within the collective unconscious? Because it seemed to me that there's a lot of faulty data that needs to be purged from the system.
Mm.
So I just don't know how that would happen. I'm not sure,
So
who's folding the collective unconscious.
Yeah, Mike, who's holding the collective unconsciousness?
Well, hopefully this should be the job of philosophers and poets.
Right.
But as we've become more scientific, we've rejected a lot of the collective unconscious. We've rejected any sort of woo-woo type notions at all, because this is what we're getting at, right? Outside of rote words, like outside of saying like Luke Skywalker is Joseph Campbell's hero's archetype, it means what does that mean to you? It means absolutely nothing. We have lost the psychic connection between the hero and something higher, so like a god type thing, right? Like that's why we shared these ancient tales so long ago, because it gave meaning to the notion of being a hero. Whereas now, it seems like something like you look at something like, what the average person goes sees superhero movies for, it seems to be for sexual appeal. So like, oh yeah, I get to see Thor without his shirt. Great. But you lose any sort of deeper symbolic notion of what Thor represents.
And depends on which Thor movie. No.
Yeah. Well, so
in the future.
Yeah.
Well, early Thor was not my cup of tea, but anyway, go ahead.
So I would say, so maybe perhaps the mythology itself is the cleaning apparatus of the collective unconscious. So yeah, that would venture to say that if we're destroying our mythology, then we might be causing an unconscious catastrophe.
Yeah, because we're just losing these, like even with religion, right? Like people that, like when I would go to church when I was younger, you look around and you see some people going through the traditional steps, but you also see some people like, balancing their checkbooks when that was a thing. You see people nowadays probably on their phone or
flipping coupons.
Like you see people doing a bunch of other things.
Right.
That reminds me of a Simpsons episode. Oh, sorry.
Go for it.
Well, they were passing the collection plate, and everyone's putting money in, and Homer gets his wallet out and he puts a little coupon in there. And Marge is like, 50 cents off shake and bake. Homer! And it's just funny though, because like, with mythology, I'm just curious. Well, okay, so wait, did you know the follow-up to that? What did you just say?
No, I just said that's a valuable coupon.
I think that's what Homer said in that scene, something along those lines. But no, anyway, I was gonna kind of get back on track by saying, like, the question about the source of the mythology, if it was, this like cross-cultural, taking myths from all over the world and also individuated through psychotherapy sessions and his own research and methodology, wouldn't it stand to reason that even as our mythologies change, so maybe we know less about Aesop's fables, but we know more about like Marvel or whatnot.
Only at the surface level. We lose, like Aesop fables become important because there's an element of belief, right? There's this thing that nobody believes that Marvel is like the Marvel universe is real and it happened on this earth.
Well, and further, there's so we even take the easiest one, the hero's journey, right? There's been a continuative, sort of campaign to bastardize the hero's journey, to eliminate catharsis. And Ayla, we've had this conversation just a couple of days ago when we were talking about it. Yeah, well, yeah, and we were just talking about this concept, and I was mentioning to you, I hate this anti-catharsis ending sort of stuff that they're doing now with movies, especially when you have the hero journey involved. So it's like, The hero goes into the depths of the underworld to retrieve his love or treasure or whatever. He's supposed to bring it back, and he's supposed to have learned something, but maybe have lost something along the way, but came out stronger for it. Now it's like it's sort of like a bastardization of, almost even a cynical outlook on the hero's journey. And I think that that's kind of damaging for humans in a subconscious way, because we want catharsis out of our hero's journey. And when we don't get it, it becomes demoralizing.
Yeah. And the hero should sacrifice things. Like, we should have it instilled that, like, we have to do things to gain something greater. We have to go through some trial. There has to be some sort of work that harms us, where we may lose something, but the end goal is better for everyone, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
it hardens the person through the myth. It toughens them up.
Or it's the realization that, we love an underdog. So if we're going through something terrible, we have the hope of transcendence at some point.
Well, that's the whole point, right? It's this idea, like, and that's kind of my point, is like, if there's no payoff for the hero at the end, then we're telling people that there's no use in trying, because there will never be a payoff. So this mythology stuff is really important, because it told us long, long ago that if you try X, then this could possibly happen, then Y could possibly happen. Now we're doing is, you can try X, Y, and Z, but you're still not going to get your results. Like that, more and more I'm seeing stories like that, which, while they can be true to reality, are doing a disservice to the meta truth that we try to structure our society around.
And there's something inherently sacrificial by being an underdog, though, right? Like, you don't have access to the same resources or the same strength or the same whatever that something else has, right?
This is a David and Goliath myth.
Yeah. And also, Jung also explored dreams a lot, heavy in dream symbology. He was a contemporary with Freud, so again, psychoanalytics. The only thing that he disagreed with as far as dreams, so like, while Freud has this notion of free association, where dreams had their symbols, and those symbols were kind of objective, Jung believed that symbols within dreams are highly subjective. So two people could have the same dream, but without knowing both the individuals, you couldn't really give any sort of analysis to them.
Right. Everything didn't go back to your mother issues or your father issues. Yeah.
And these sort of problems that people have, or like psychological disturbances that people have, can be overcome through exploring your own unconscious and also the collective unconscious. But getting back to the mythologies, no, like, there is something damaging that's being done, and it's because we have let too many things kind of introduce themselves into the mythology, whether they be scientific rigor, whether they be ideologies, whatever have you. We've distracted ourselves from creating a story that on the surface is both appealing and then has this illuminating psychic value that gives it an emotional charge that really moves you in a way or another, right?
Yeah.
And we seem to
something that lasts through the ages.
Yeah. And that tends to be through emotion. That seems to be like this latent space that we can all connect to, unless you're a psychopath. But the story can like appeal to the mind, the heart, and the spine. But all of those seem to be pulled in by some sort of emotion.
And so what do you think it is that's made these stories last so long and be so good? I mean, like, as Ayla mentioned, we are trying to replicate this stuff with Marvel and other superhero myths and stuff. And is it just the superficiality of it all, or perhaps the oversaturation? Like, why do you think that the myth of Hercules is going to outlast, the myth of Doctor Strange?
Simplicity and emotion. Like, Strange can be... There's no easy way to start to dive into like quantum mechanics, right? Whereas with Hercules, it becomes very illustrated, like in a higher dimensional. Right now, I'm going to get real convoluted in a higher dimensional sense, right? You have like 12 trials for Hercules. He has to fight this 3-headed giant dog. It's terrifying. where he has to, go through these things that seem like overwhelming tasks for any person, but he does it in ways that every person can understand.
Mm,
Whereas
mm-hmm.
Doctor Strange is a wizard and we don't really know how he operates. We have faint clues, we have faint ideas.
Huh.
Everything's still surface level, right?
That's
Like
interesting. Yeah. Well,
so look
because
at
like it makes me also think, because and then it's like, okay, so what is it about so there's something more believable about somebody being literally a god than somebody, like there's something more relatable to a man that is nearer to godness than a wizard.
demigod. Yeah, because wizards, so the wizard archetype as a whole, like that magician archetype, implies some sort of secret knowledge, right?
Mm,
And that secret knowledge isn't omnipotent. It's not like it knows everything, but we have an easier idea wrapping our head around something that may know everything, or something that can punch a hole through anything. We know what that
mm,
looks like. But
mm,
like it's the same problems you may run into with Scarlet Witch, right? And if you can't read the spells that the Scarlet Witch is doing, you have this disconnect now.
mm,
But I
mm.
can visually see everything that Hercules does. To even put it in the language of film, right? I
Right.
don't know exactly what the Scarlet Witch may be doing. I know exactly what Hercules is doing. And I
Hmm.
can relate to that in a very easy way.
Do you think it's the finality of the Hercules myth? Because, like with Marvel, it's still emerging. There's still producers that can carry it. And it is a complex storyline. And it's also not a linear storyline. Like from my understanding, there's a whole bunch of different universes where, like in this one, the X-Men and the Avengers meld into one universe. In another universe, Superman dies and stays dead. Like there's a bunch of different offshoots. But like you're right, like with the Hercules myth, there was only a set number of stories with him.
Hold
And
on, hold on, hold on. Are you implying that the
You were
DCEU
gonna let
and the
that slip.
Marvel EU? I was gonna let it slide, but then I was
Yeah.
like, no, 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 because there's a crossover event where in the comics where DC fights Marvel,
Oh
and
yeah.
it's amazing because I think you see Superman hold Captain America's shield and Thor's
I'm not
hammer, and I
saying it's
lose
not
my mind.
amazing.
I'm just saying though, are you saying that these two cinematic universes are going to cross over one day, and we're going to get like a Zack Snyder Marvel versus DC movie?
I
You
mean,
never know. With the
DC
way that
needs
they
the
have
help.
become cash cows, yeah. It's just a matter of money, not time, money.
Warner
Um,
Brothers might as well sell to Disney.
Oh God, no! Please don't. We
I
don't.
know.
We
That
don't
was
need
a
any
joke.
more monopoly.
I know.
No, no, but it's not in the finality of it, right? Because when you're first reading the Hercules stories, you know nothing about them, right? So you're coming across these stories one by one, and
well,
this you are just like with Marvel, and you can
yeah.
read one trial at a time and take years and breaks. It still doesn't move the emotion from it.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I don't I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think it's just the idea that like the Hercules myth is something that I was taught early, like in the 4th grade. It was something that was, codified in my formal gonna get a test on it education. And so it's like of note. And then it's also something that my parents had to learn and their
Hmm.
parents before them. So with the Marvel analogy or like basically like the emergence of possibly having new myths, it's going to be several generations before we see the myths
Oh, I
get
wonder.
the level. Maybe
I
I
don't
don't
know. I,
know. I
I
don't
They
wonder.
pass
know.
it down through the genes. I can see that.
But I also wonder if there's something to the fact that this is, the Marvel franchise is a visual platform, whereas most of these were, folklore spread by word of mouth.
Yeah, like it was the time of doing and not thinking. So there's you like when these stories were shared, they were shared knee jerk, and everything was accepted as belief. Whereas with the
Mm.
Marvel movies, you can kind of sit there and watch them and be like, "Oh, that doesn't look quite right." Oh, I know from the comics that doesn't happen. Then, even if you slice it away, so this is a completely different universe and not the comics at all, you can still find gripes. You're not accepting them, right? And they're also
Yeah.
not being handed down by an authority figure. Right?
Right.
They're not held in the same light that old like Aesop fables are. And there's arguably not even there's not much of a lesson to be learned from Marvel films, right?
Right.
You don't
And
watch them to gain a philosophical understanding.
that is true. And I wonder if, too, there's just something about the ability to allow your imagination to fill in the gaps. Because if you think about the myth of Hercules, that was an oral tradition, most likely before it was written down. And then, in order to relive that story, you kind of had to read it. And you didn't have to have it visually presented in front of you, although I'm sure there were plays about it in later Greek sort of tradition. But I wonder if there's something there's something integral about allowing the imagination to fill in gaps, and perhaps that there's a certain level of vaguety to these myths so that you can fill in those gaps. Whereas a Marvel movie is like, this is what you're getting, and maybe you can read into it, but what you see is what you get.
Yeah, it still becomes like you're looking for Easter eggs with Marvel movies, right? You're not looking for the hidden meaning between a
Right.
character or two characters. And plus, to the Greeks, they also had the foresight and understanding that it wasn't meant to, like, what was on the page is not actually what happened. So they tried to understand what it meant on a deeper level. And you may see that with Marvel, with people who are willing to break down um, popular culture, but they end up still tying it to older mythologies or abstracting it away into a Jungian archetype sense. And it's easier just to do Hercules than it is to, I don't know, evaluate Thor or something like that as a dual, as a Jekyll and Hyde type personality, right? Just because all the information's already there. But in time, there may be people who do that. You already kind of see that with animated Disney movies and like Jordan Peterson, right? So it's not that far fetched to think of somebody else who would watch Marvel movies and try to draw similar conclusions, but they have to come from an academic standard to gain any or academia to gain any sort of authority to be able to speak to a wide enough audience.
And still, they would only just be reference points to something before that, which I think is interesting because, like there's no new story under the sun, right? So it's like, even if you were to take Marvel movies and cross-examine them as mythology, you would just have to relate it back to a previous mythology.
Yeah.
Because something else would already have existed in order to reference it. Because, like think about the concept of Thor, right? You said the Dr. and Jekyll and Mr. Hyde archetype. Well, that archetype already exists. It's called Dr. and Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
So it's like you already have it. So you're just basically adding a layer onto an interpretation of the already established mythology.
And it may be where those stories originally came from, right? With Hulk and that stuff. They may have started off as an archetype that was then twisted, that was pulled in maybe through dreams or something like that, but was twisted in a way to make it transformative and new, right? Because Hulk is not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Right.
But they have the same underlying meanings, or the same underlying mechanisms.
Yes.
Right?
Just like the Wolfman.
Yeah.
And the Wolfman is the same sort of archetype. Yeah.
But yeah, no. So I think it may take a while for anybody to start to dive into Marvel and that, or if the comics, you definitely can. But I don't. Obviously, there's only 7 stories, so you don't have to really worry about, like telling a new story. But I wonder if there's more archetypes that can be added, or at least be identified within our collective unconscious as human beings, just all of us. Right? And if we can expose this process of, you could use movies and entertainment as a way to facilitate processes of individuation. That's what we used to do with it, right? Like you would pick your favorite Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle that you wanted to be, which goes back to the 4 humors. You can start to do facilitates certain things like that, but it all happens behind the scenes, like because this sort of uh, Jungian psychology teaching isn't commonplace, but it happens no matter what, right? Like we all have a favorite superhero, we all have a favorite whatever that we identify with, and so we either are or want to be like those archetypes that we can abstract from that superhero or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I still think that you know, like unless our history is forgotten, we might end up just referencing to the ancient stuff. You know, like we could probably pepper in the more current mythology to sort of enhance perspectives, but it seems as though that we're always going to fall back on the more tried and true mythologies, unless
Yeah,
they become forgotten.
I mean, they just might have bigger weight in our collective unconscious, and nothing ever gets forgotten; just gets reimagined, right?
Mm.
Like listening to Young, he pointed out something interesting that was in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that ended up being a near word for word copy of some old ship log from the 1600s. There's no way that Nietzsche could have, just hand copied. He didn't think it was, he didn't think that he plagiarized this log or anything like that. He just saw it, the connecting lines as interesting because it's like it was forgotten out of human consciousness, but then
It
was
came back.
pulled back out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, as we talked about remote viewing with sci-fi writers, um, philosophers, poets, writers as a whole, scribes may have a way to pull out things from this collective unconscious that was written way back when, but we've forgotten about, and reimagine it for modern sensibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I get it for sure. Yeah, I think it's all just pretty darn fascinating.
It's strange for sure. And you start to dive down there. Even like, you can get into like, yeah, biblical symbols and things like that. They make sense within a certain context, but they can still even be pulled out of that context and be connected with something else that some other human on the other side of the world has created.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like these symbols end up become like, they say they're invented, but the genus of that word ends up being something like to seek, to find. So these symbols are more discovered. And it's like if we're diving into this unconscious pool as a whole species and pulling things out of it. And as creatives try to create something quote unquote new or prolific or with, that lasts the test of time, but they have to have that emotional punch. It just can't be all spectacle.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the challenge with making a story is, having that surface level spectacle, of course, that it's logical sense, not like a jumble of words or something like that, but having that, like the iceberg, having that underbelly to it that invokes a emotional psychic charge that shakes people to the point where it will always be known throughout the test of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's almost like we're kind of striving to bring back the fifth dimension. You know what I mean? Like when we think about like the concept of the muses and divine inspiration and all of these things that kind of spurred this mythology in the first place. Whether it be the finding of symbols or the creating of a great myth. It's almost like we're trying to, in some way, distillize the information extracted from the fifth dimension and present it in a sort of holistic way for people to digest, almost a memeable way for people to digest.
Well, you have to be able to reduce the dimensionality, right?
Mm-hmm.
We only have, sorry. Oh, that was a burp. Sorry. We only have 3 dimensions to express ourselves in at any time, right? So I guess a fourth as well. So we have to take that 5th dimensional information and reduce it down to 4 dimensions. And you most humanly you see this with actors, right? They are the ones who are changing their personas most often, who at least in theory should have some connection, some awareness of the collective unconscious that allows them to do this. Like they may, I've never been to acting school, so I don't know like the technicals about it, but that's still surface level. Like you have intuitive actors that can just reach into the unconscious and pull out and channel a character.
Right.
You look at that person, you're like, yeah, I can't see anybody else being that character. There's no way anybody else would work. And so it's this active, yeah, it's living out that sort of Jungian psychology on command, which is why some characters are a lot harder on actors than others.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like the Joker, for example, tends to be one of those characters that are, if you let really live in your personal unconscious, you kind of go crazy.
Yeah. And Jesus also tends to be one of those characters, which is interesting enough. I think Jim Caviezel like nearly got struck by lightning during his crucifixion scene. Like there was like a whole list of catastrophes that happened with the Passion of the Christ. Yeah. So it is weird because like there is that sort of, and you know, I've heard plenty of actors kind of speak in this manner in kind of a superstitious way because they believe they're channeling something. And they think that they're kind of like, you know, being a conduit for some other sort of energy that inhabits them during that time. So yeah, I can definitely see it's as a representation of this sort of collective unconscious that resides in this fifth dimensional space that we have to bring down into a fourth dimension and then reduce down into a third or second dimension.
Yeah, becomes a teams of people's jobs to cram all that into 2 dimensions. Yeah, I mean, it's not crazy to think about in that light. Now, it may sound crazy, but that's only because our collective conscious becomes more and more scientific. And anything that science can't explain in a written language becomes asinine to think about, right? Like it becomes silly.
Passe.
Yeah, but that supernatural element is so important for myth, arts, poetry, anything like that, especially religion, that you need that superstitious element. It also adds meaning. Yeah, it's pretty much the reason why that conduit exists, right? Like,
yeah.
I'm sure you want to get into gematria. Was it the feeling with numbers?
Yeah, gematria.
Yeah, gematria. So there's like the number 13, right? Like, to one person, it's just a number, but to another, it's this taboo thing. And then now they're spending their whole day on watch for bad things that can happen.
Right.
The whole, you know, physiological system has changed. They're now under extreme stress.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of like, because I've had this concept, or not this concept, but I've had this thought rattling in my brain and a thought about the afterlife and this sort of concept of being able to make heaven or hell on earth. And I really do believe that most of our illusions of afterlife and sort of our representations of mythical afterlives have to do with state of minds and how we are able to put ourselves in those sort of states while we are living. And so, yeah, I mean, like, I definitely see that sort of like ability for you to be encompassed with a certain level of superstition that would then throw you into a day of hell where you're walking on eggshells waiting for the other shoe to fall.
Yeah. And humans start to look a lot like automata, like state machines in a way, right? That are pulling from the fifth dimension and changing their internal state to expect some external thing to happen. And we already do that whenever, you know, I guess if you have a conscience, you do that. If you do something even moderately bad and then you're just waiting to get in trouble, or I guess kids do that, right? Like they
Oh, I had that happen to me yesterday, or not yesterday, the other day.
What?
Oh, dude, I did something terrible and I feel really bad about it, but and it's like, I never do this, but I got really upset. Like I was driving in the morning and I was really groggy and I was trying to make a left across 4 lanes of traffic, and I'm very diligent about looking. So I look left, I look right. It's clear on my left. It's clear on my right. I look again to my left to see if it's clear again. And whoever was driving like 80 miles per hour down this road, because I had inched just maybe a foot to start to go. And this car was laying on its horn because it came out of nowhere. And then I flipped the person off and they stopped their car. And they stopped their car and then they tried to like confront me about it, but then like I just ended up feeling really bad for the rest of the day. I'm like, that wasn't me. I don't do that sort of thing. Like I feel really shitty about that. And so yeah, like I definitely understand where it's like you kind of construct these sort of ways to live through this sort of archetypical interpretation, and then like when you go against it, like you can feel that sort of like dis-ease or disharmony. Disharmony is probably the best word.
Yeah, and you've like from a state machine point of view, you've entered in a new, not a new state, but something in your internal machine that you're just not used to. So you feel that even more intensely, right?
Oh yeah.
Because if you just drove around flipping everybody off,
then I wouldn't feel anything about it.
Yeah, but you've entered into this like emotional state, emotional cognitive state where it's like, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. I feel awful, and I'm in the same way. There's little minor things that like I'm sure nobody else feels bad about, but because it's me, it's like I've broken this archetype. I've pulled down. I've behaved in some other archetype or some con of my archetype, and I just don't like doing, and now entered into the state where I feel crummy all day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very strange, but it's also very beautiful because it's like it's an internal reminder that like we know there's something deep inside of us that kind of understands what the right things to do are. And you know, whether that's sort of like ingrained in us biologically or, you know, socially, probably both, archetypically, there's something really kind of interesting about that, like gut feeling you have when you transgress your moral code or you sort of, step outside of your box.
You know, you have a intuition about it, and you're reaching, you're feeling that, maybe even you're feeling in some sense that it's bad for the collective. Like unconsciously you're feeling that it's bad, and it pulls out this thing through emotion, which gives it the psychic charge.
Yeah, definitely.
Ayla?
She's just absorbing subconsciously.
A little bit. No, I was just listening to you guys kind of just going back and forth, and I don't really have much more to add to it. Yeah, I'm just kind of passive unconscious listener. No, that's not right.
Being the hitchhiker, the passenger archetype.
A little bit.
Just along for the ride.
Yeah, you know. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, and
but
Nick,
Ayla, you've gone through that before. You know what I've
someone off?
No, but like
feeling bad
not
about
the exact situation.
Something.
Yeah, but like interpersonally, that sort of guilt you feel when you transgress or you feel that you've transgressed on somebody.
Oh God, well, don't get me started on guilt, because I feel like well, obviously I'm a moral person, and I think guilt is a funny one because I sometimes go in circles. Like, so I started this conversation out with boundaries, and it's like, at what point do you cease to be responsible for your reaction when you gave fair warning, you know? And so it's like, you know, we're human and we can fail, and we know what sets us up to fail, and we can make moves to try to minimize those transgressions, failures, outbursts, or whatnot. But you know, life happens, and so I think it's just like, I don't know. No. This is why I'm listening. I don't have a definitive response on any of this.
I'm pretty susceptible to guilt, and it's probably just like a Catholic upbringing sort of thing. But I've also seen where it's been used to manipulate me. So that's where like you got to pull in that rebel archetype and just kind of go nuts. And it's been bad. Like I remember getting real angry at a coworker for not hanging up the clothes, I guess. But I could have hung up the clothes, and it would, like, I could have got around that whole situation, but the energetic and just psychological not disorder, disturbance that happened for both me and the coworkers that blew up into this giant thing was not worth. It would have been easier just to fold the clothes, but then it sets the precedence of I'll always fold the clothes for you, and it's
Yes.
not. You can't always fold the clothes for the person.
Yeah.
So, like it gets into like this weird space of do I want to feel guilty or do I want to pull out this really dark mask and just wear it and just deal with those repercussions?
Yeah, and that's where
Right.
the social contractualism comes into play, right? Like we all rely on each other to pitch in the amount that we're supposed to, and like it when people abuse that sort of system, it really like it angers us, like we don't like the person that doesn't do any work on the group project, right? Like and so I think that there's something about that collectively we don't like that person, and those, but that doesn't mean we can ever get rid of that person, because there will always be that type of person, because that's an archetype of itself.
Yeah, there's like archetype in the group. Like, and there's a what is it? A number that like you only like you have 5% of any company doing 90% of the work. Like, take
The
1%.
distribution.
Yeah, so like you're gonna get that even in school project. I think I was the kid that always did all the work for the group. Were you, or were you like the sometimes yes, sometimes no?
I was the kind of like, I made sure that my section was done. And I
Okay.
always try to make sure that the boundaries were very clear. And I made sure that the teacher knew, like if there was somebody who wasn't pulling their weight, I'm like, no, this was my section of the project, just so you know.
Hilarious.
Nice.
Hilarious.
What about you, Ayla?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried really hard to get out of group projects because like I mean, I didn't really have them in high school. It was just kind of like you take a test or you do an essay or something like that. But I know in college I was like, look, you guys don't have 3 jobs and a mess of a family situation, so I don't want to be on a group project where you're going to postpone the meeting. That means I have to get work off, and then you postpone the meeting and I have to get work off. I lose money, and then I'm going to be really, really mad because now I am going hungry and I'm hangry. And this don't get me started. Yeah. Like just don't put me on a group project with rich
There's
people.
no
It's not okay. I mean, not rich people, but like
was
rich students that don't comprehend like
the
what
possible struggle. Yeah.
exactly, right, totally, I'm trying to think, I think I did group study projects, but even then, like, you just end up chatting and eating snacks, so, yeah, I think I'm kind of a loner in that respect.
In high school, I was so traumatized for doing all the work that in college, I was
Which
like,
poor
nope,
thing.
I'm gonna work alone on everything.
Yeah, I'll do 5
Nobody.
people's work rather than work in a group.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. And most teachers were okay with it. And then I had like a few projects where I had to, and that all went socially sideways as it always does. But it's just I would much rather do 5 people's work
Yeah.
than
Mhm.
be in a group project.
Like, make up extra students. Yeah, it's gonna be me, Timmy, Sarah, Constantine. Like, it's gonna be this weird new Hercules. And, yeah, they're
And
not
Aesop, they're
enrolled. What a
like,
weird thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
they're like, none
Aesop.
of these people are in this. They haven't. Nobody's in this class and haven't enrolled in this university. What is this? What are we looking at?
Right,
Yeah,
right, right, right.
yeah, no. So that's pretty much all I have. Well, yeah, that's it for this sort of no note collective unconscious discussion. Um, I do want to bring in. I mean, unless there's questions and stuff like that. But
No.
next time we're gonna get into anima, animus, because we've set up the mythological backgrounds, the understanding and stuff, and get into more like personal unconscious, like the shadow, the more Jungian individual space rather than the collective space. I just thought it was good just to isolate the collective unconscious and try to have a conversation showing how we kind of do this inherently, and bringing this information to light seems to be good.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it was a great conversation, especially one that was unplanned. That was nice. You know, I definitely appreciate it. So thanks, man. That was a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for listening, you guys. We hope that you enjoyed the conversation. I definitely did. I know Ayla did, and I think that we'll probably have extensions of similar conversations in the future. Please be on the lookout for that. In the meantime, if you have any comments for us, please feel free to leave us a comment. And if you feel so inclined, we would very much appreciate a subscription on our YouTube. That is youtube.com/exofathom. Very much appreciate all of you guys out there. Appreciate you, Mike and Ayla. And do we have anything else before we want to wrap up?
I think that's good.
Yeah. Cool beans. Well, until next time, Cognonauts, you stay out there and we'll catch you on the next Exofathom. Good night.
Peace.
Later.